Professor Chacon, why does this false narrative that immigrants are responsible for increasing crime rates, and you said there's just no data to support that, continue for more than a century? And children and grandchildren of immigrants are saying it now,
Yeah.
the very ones that were 50, 60 years ago accused of this, falsely accused of this, are now saying it regarding other immigrant groups.
Yeah. Yeah, this this seems to keep happening.
Yeah.
I mean, I think so. Why does it persist? I think partly because people, are inherently threatened by strangers, right? That's it's
Yeah.
biological and it's eternal, and so it then becomes very natural to assume that outsiders, strangers, people we don't know, aren't like us and are threatening to us. So I think because of that, when politicians sort of are looking for a scapegoat, immigrants are a really good and easy scapegoat, right? Because they are the stranger,
And they
and
also don't
and
vote, right?
and they don't vote.
Yeah.
Right? They can't vote,
Yeah.
and so it becomes really easy. And I think we saw this probably most pointedly recently with the spikes in COVID rates in places like Texas and Florida, and the governors of both of those states blaming migrants, with again sort of zero evidence that there's really any connection between immigrant flow and COVID infection rates. And we could look to a lot of other factors in those states: bans on mask mandates, failures of vaccination rates. Right, there's lots of other things going on, but it was easy to just sort of point to immigrants as the source of the problem, as a source of disease, as the source of crime, as the source of disorder, because that's sort of a natural tendency to not look inside, not look at what our neighbors and our friends and our family members might be doing to cause harm, but to look outside for the source of the harm. So that's why I think it's a potent
Makes
narrative.
immigrants easy targets because they're relatively speaking powerless
Yeah, yeah, they're
compared to, yeah,
politically marginalized, and
exactly.
often racially marginalized as well, right? So those two things together, I think, sort of make this uh, an easy
We,
system for scapegoating.
we recently had a podcast episode with Professor Carrie Baker of Smith College about the history of sexual harassment. And she highlighted that in the history of sexual harassment, um, Black women and immigrants bore the brunt of it because they were, relatively speaking, politically powerless.
Right.
So this also plays out with the narrative of immigration and
Right.
blaming them for crime. Interesting. Professor Chacon, having lived in a border town yourself, El Paso, Texas, is there anything relevant to our discussion from your own life experiences that you wish to share?
Oh, lots of things. I,
Get to
I,
know me. Get to know me.
I could I could think of just a couple of things that leap to mind. So
Please.
one is and it's something that you said a few minutes ago. You said, people who are the children of immigrants, who are sort of second and third generation, are the ones who are spreading the anti-immigrant
Yeah,
narrative,
I
right? That
see it
they've
all the
bought
time.
into it, that they've decided that they are the good people that need to sort of exclude the bad. And growing up on a border town, I saw that. So second generation Mexican Americans um, suddenly worried about Mexican migration. So I think one thing
Second
that we,
generation.
yeah, oh
Oh my
yeah,
God, it's
and,
just one step away.
right, one step removed and hardly geographically removed. So I think one thing that that is it's important to remember that, because it's not that demographics are going to shift the way that we think about immigration, right? We all are, susceptible, I think, to these forms of thinking, to
This
these
is
sort
going
of
to happen over
shortcuts.
and over again. Then,
So
wait.
unless we strengthen our education
Yeah.
around uh, immigration, then we will just continue to see these patterns play out again and again. So that's one point that I would make. And the second point that I would make is just that I grew up in El Paso in the 70s and 80s. I moved away for college and for law school. And when I moved away, so I was far from the border, I was
Yeah.
always stunned at the way that people talked about the border as this kind of site of chaos and disorder and crime, and a place that was sort of in need of a strong federal presence,
That's
which
sort of the general
which didn't
perception,
yeah,
right?
which did not resonate with my experience
It didn't.
growing up on the border, where my city was quite safe. If you look at sort of crime statistics, they're very low. And so it's interesting to me that it's often as you move further away from the border that the horror stories about the place that is the border become more powerful. And I think it's worth sort of thinking about the fact that millions of people live and work on the border and live and work across the border in terms of their family members and their communities every day. And that it's just another place, and that sort of viewing it as pathological and exceptionally violent is problematic and a really bad way to make policy.
Is El Paso and other border towns, are they still vibrant? This question is sounding so stupid already. I already know, but they still. I'm following your narrative, Dr. Chacon. But they're still vibrant, safe places for millions to live, despite all that we've been
Yeah.
talking about politically in the last 5 years.
So first, I have to say I'm not a doctor. I don't have my
I'm
PhD.
sorry,
I'm a
Professor
PhD. So
Chacon. No,
no,
I
no,
mean that.
I appreciate the honorific. I just have not earned it. um, and are they still vibrant places? Yes. I mean, I think one of the things that's fascinating, though, is to watch how that landscape has been militarized. Right. So when I
That's my question. That's where my question
yeah.
comes from. Like 200. I don't have the figure in front of me, Professor Chacon, but I think July was the highest arrest rate in the last 20 some years of immigrants entering. So when you hear these things, you really think of these border towns as being, as you said, militarized zones almost.
Yeah. Yeah. So we've spent literally billions of dollars on fencing and technologies and people to police that border space. And I think many of those billions of dollars would have been better spent uh, trying to ensure that people have safe homes that they don't need to leave in communities across Latin America, and that when they do leave and do need to leave, that we have an immigration system that treats them humanely and processes their often legitimate claims effectively. And what we've done instead is just sort of gone for the wall solution, whether that's a physical wall that Trump talked about or the kind of increased presence of Border Patrol agents at the border that we've seen under every administration, really, from Clinton on. It's changed the shape of the border, and it's changed the face of the border, and it does have an impact on communities, and it isn't one that seems to have borne out or been worth the price tag. It seems like there are better ways to spend that kind of money.
I want to close our podcast conversation with the following question. Do you think that immigrant activists and the immigration community in general, there are many rich immigrants as well, from all sorts of races, have just done a poor job of promoting themselves, promoting their cause? For example, we just spend a whole almost hour talking about how this data about immigrants increasing crime rate. I mean, this narrative is bogus. Data doesn't support it. Yet I found it in a teensy little sort of side note in the Wall Street Journal. You would think something that debunks a major political narrative would be plastered in headline news, New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Maybe I'm just a super nerd, but I don't think so. It was a major political news. So do you think immigrants are doing a poor job of promoting themselves, marketing themselves, or these immigrant sort of support institutions that are sort of driven by citizens, U.S. citizens, are not marketing themselves properly? I know we're going on a tangent, but it's such a sort
Yeah.
of just a continuation of our conversation here.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I wouldn't be one to criticize immigrant serving organizations or activists
No,
for
no,
sort
it
of
wasn't meant as a criticism at all.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
No, I mean, and I think sometimes sometimes they worry and I worry that if you sort of seize on the narrative that, hey, we're not criminals, you've already bought into a couple of problematic things, right? You've bought into the notion that like the criminal legal system is functioning the way it should, and we
You
all know
already
it's
so you
not.
give it legitimacy by bringing it up.
Right.
Interesting.
And we all know that's a problematic system, right? We've been talking about that certainly for the last 18 months. There's been a national
Yes,
conversation about
yes,
that.
yes, yes.
And so I think, there is some reluctance to sort of double down on that story, because how crime is
That's a very
identified
good
and
point. Yeah.
prosecuted and punished isn't always fair. And so to then say, well, that should be the metric that we use to measure people's worth, that can be problematic, right? So I think that's a worry, and so I think the pivot has to be not so much like we don't commit crime, but that we're part
That's a
of this
terrible message to
community.
come out and say.
we're part of this community, right?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
we
yeah,
we work here, we live here, we love here,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
and that the fate of the nations that we've come from are deeply interconnected with the with the fate of this nation, right? And when we think about sort of US intervention in Central America, US economic imperialism in Mexico, US intervention in places like Afghanistan, we can see the way that the the kind of the people who are coming here are often coming here because they have been touched by US policy. And so that to me is a really important part of the story. People
Yeah.
are often surprised. Why are they coming here?
We don't want them here.
Why can't we don't want them here? Can't they leave us alone? And I think often the answer is, well, you didn't leave us alone,
Exactly.
right?
You
There
were
are
there.
ways in which these histories and fates are interconnected. And we really have to see that to understand that it's not that we're sitting here in isolation and people are coming and we should decide whether they get to come in or not, but that instead we are working in this sort of deeply interconnected world. And we have to sort of answer problems like resource allocation and climate change, right, together, in ways that allow people to thrive. And I feel like the immigration narrative is, if we get too caught up in, should someone who commits a crime be able to stay here, that misses the bigger picture about why people are moving in the first place, how our policies are impacting on people across borders, and how we need to think about that systematically if we really want people to be able to sort of live where they want to live and thrive where they are.